Welcome to our class number 5 of this semester. We have 6 classes in this semester of the Trump presidency. This is day 1019, if I've done my counting right. And the presidential statement I pulled out today is, read the transcript. Now, Democrats are going to say it differently. They'll say, read the transcripts. But the president is saying, read the transcript. We'll do our normal order of presentation. We'll talk about what's happened in the news since we last met. We'll talk about the presidency, the man and the institution of the presidency, the presidential agenda in the short term, the next 90 days. Look at presidential policies, and then we'll get into presidential nomination race. Let's talk about the big news since we last met. There was an election in parts of America, the 2019. That seems odd to us Californians that other than some local government elections, and I don't think maybe some school district elections, it's mostly we're off election cycle in November of the odd number of years, but other states are on the election cycle, and some very important ones did occur. A lot of commentators are trying to spin what that means. It's almost every election. Proponents and opponents try to say, this was a great election, never had a better election. So we do know that in Virginia, Democrats won every statewide office and won control of the legislature. We also know that in the state of Kentucky, that the gubernatorial election has come down to about 5,000 votes, and it's going into a process that is in effect a recount process. The Democrat is on top. The Republican governor had the distinction of being the governor of the 50 states with the least positive job approval rating. So he had a lot of, he started pretty far back. One of his famous statements was during a teacher strike that every day the teachers would be out on strike, a child will be molested, and the blame is them, because that child would have been in school if it wasn't for the teachers striking. Which he was rebuked by by one of the legislative leaders of his own party as going a little bit too far. But that campaign became nationalized. That campaign for governor became a campaign that the incumbent governor and the White House decided to make a referendum on the impeachment process. And the results are maybe not clear-cut because it's so close, but when you consider that Republicans won every other statewide office by large margins, that there's 2 probably intervening factors that you probably could point to make a hypothesis on. One was the governor was unusually unpopular, and it was hard to salvage him. Or 2, that because of making it a national referendum on impeachment of the president and possible removal of the president, that he went from being a political corpse to showing signs of life. But there was other elections. Republicans did well in Mississippi. They do well in Mississippi. The only Democratic on a statewide office, Wren for governor. He lost It was, by about 7 points, 7 to 9 points. But one of the big stories was in the suburbs of many of the cities, large metropolitan areas that had elections, was the surging strength for Democrats in those state offices that seemed to parallel the same surge that occurred on the congressional seats that Republicans lost to Democrats in many of those suburban settings. The Wall Street Journal had both a podcast on an editorial page podcast and this editorial today talking about the problem the party faces in the suburbs. But they conclude in part, these results forecast nothing definitive about 2020, though the anti-GOP trend of 3 years should worry the White House. I think that's probably a good way of citing the facts. If there was a Democratic backlash against impeachment, it could be seen in a state house race outside of Houston, in one of the suburbs of Houston, which of course Houston being the fourth largest city sprawls a lot, but they still have some suburbs. And Democrats are relatively close in capturing the lower house of the Texas legislature, which would have a dramatic impact on reapportionment. But there was a special election in a seat outside of Houston, sometimes called the most Democratic city south of the Mason-Dixon line, in which Republicans did quite well, and they won that special election by double digits. So it's hard to tell what that election said. Though if I was in the White House or with the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, I would be concerned. There's no reason to be happy. Democrats, on the other hand, can only be modestly happy that, we're still playing. The overall margin, Democrats were winning congressional seats on the margins in the last election was by outperforming their registration by 9%. In the Virginia seats, they were outperforming by about 4 to 5%, except in the open seats, in which they were outperforming by about 9%. Now, in Pennsylvania, where the suburbs showed great strength for Democrats, some of the rural counties flipped in their board of supervisors, called county commissioners, flipped to Republican control from Democratic control. Matter of fact, I think there was 9 counties that had the partisan in Pennsylvania. They select county offices on a partisan ballot, flipped, and 5 were picked up by Republicans and 4 were picked up by Democrats. So Republicans can still grow in the rural areas. The Democratic suburbs were more populated, and those counties were more populated. So overall, the media account, I think, is accurate that there was good news in Pennsylvania for Democrats, but not unvarnished. Oh yes, we had this. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal. The head of our number one target, a number one terrorist enemy, was killed. I mean, he apparently fled from surrendering and died, and his likely successor was killed also a couple of days later, and a trove of intelligence materials were able to be seized from where he was staying. It seemed to be an unvarnished or a very successful commando attack by U.S. forces. including, you know, if something was made for movies, this one was with a hero dog. And that dog is apparently going to come to the White House and receive a medal, or a biscuit, or a cheeseburger, whatever is on the menu that day. And I'm sure the commandos can't, because you don't, you want to keep who they are secret. The president was very happy, and his rhetoric showed very happy by the success of the raid. And he talked in great detail about some of the operational aspects of it. He had a picture taken, just as knowing this would be a historic moment. Some said this one looked a little staged compared to ones that were taken when Osama bin Laden was killed. Wall Street Journal editorialized about the lessons learned from this, how important it is to have allies, and how important it is to have bases and places where you can attack from. And the president stressed the help of the Russians. But the best I could see that the Russians did for us, and I may be wrong, I'd be happy if people fact check me on it, was not to shoot down the helicopters. When we told them that we'd be sending helicopters over. The Kurds were very much involved, both in the intelligence and in the operation and the follow-up operation. Most, I think, middle-of-the-road political commentators saw that as a political win as well as a strategic win. Now, there was some controversy, and I think some of this is displays some partisanship. But why did the president let the Russians know and the Republican leadership know, and not the Democratic leadership? He said it was operational security, but letting the Republican leadership, if you know, I think it's one thing. You apparently don't have to alert under our rules of how it's done, the legislative leadership, if it's part of a military operation under certain conditions. So that seemed pretty straightforward. But saying that the Democratic leadership, or at least those that would be alerted, which is a very small group of people, would somehow leak the information, is probably is something to say, probably could have been done a little differently. ISIS has regenerated, a leadership announcement at least, appointed a new leadership, and says it will take its revenge. Well, we'll see, right? I mean, that is something that they either will or won't. And that will be demonstrated well before next year's election. The president said that in his news conference or his press briefing immediately after his statement, that he had also pointed out before that Osama bin Laden should be taken out. And people didn't heed his warning and see what Osama did. There was some fact-checking on whether he did or not. And one of the major fact-checker organizations ruled that he may have exaggerated that a little bit. By the way, this is a comparison of the two pictures taken in the Situation Rooms under two different presidencies. There's nothing major to be said about either one. Well, I thought that one was a more historic-looking picture, operational picture. Remember, Clinton said afterwards she was having some type of allergy and was coughing and was covering her mouth. She wasn't gasping at the event. And that one looks like right out of, something that would be on a, well, you can guess what it looks like. You can see. Make your own conclusions. Not a big thing. Americans were asked in a number of polling organizations, immediately, people thought, well, what is the political impact of this? Is this going to be a make or break? How will it change public opinion? When asked in one of the first polls out, how much credit should Trump get for killing him, Baghdadi? A great deal or some, 54%. Not much, none, or none, 39%. How much credit should Obama get for killing Osama bin Laden? This was the same question in 2011, and he got 76%. What does that mean? Well, I don't know what it means, but it suggests that President Trump is not getting the same level of initial support from people who are polled than Obama did. And then there's this. The president talked about the whimpering terrorists. It's bad enough that someone has a suicide vest on and kills children, his own children and maybe other children. It's bad enough that a terrorist does that. To say that he was crying, yelling and crying and whimpering like as he ran down the tunnel has not been verified. The statement has not. Every source of verification that has been contacted that would be authoritative, the Defense Department, the generals that would give the briefing, the Secretary of Defense's office, they say they cannot collaborate on that. Some said Obama got a better response because he kept his message short. He said, we killed a terrorist that we were after, and basically left. Trump said we killed one that the world should be relieved that we killed a person that has brought so much harm and death throughout the world. Then you have the second guessers. And deserved or under-deserved, things start being looked at through a partisan filter. And Joe Biden was out, ISIS leader killed despite Trump's ineptitude as commander-in-chief. Well, that may or may not be fair, and probably not really fair. But it's what happens when you're in an environment in which we are now. Okay, so the president gets credit from at least a majority of Americans for this mission that killed ISIS and further retarded their ability to, degraded their ability to do terror, at least in the short term. President also got great economic news, generally speaking, since we last met. Jobs continue to grow, particularly in the leisure and hospitality and healthcare area. 28,000 jobs, unemployment rate of 3.6%. Continuing along a trend started in 2010 of almost consistent employment growth. More people are working who are in the age groups that you could be working. So this is, some people like to think of this as the real employment chart. measure is the percentage of the population between 25 and 54, so-called prime ages to be employed, has remarkably gone up since its low in 2010. So that's good news. Editorial writers have given the president credit for, and economic policies credit for this employment increase. Economists drilling down on why this is happening basically come to a couple of conclusions. I think a consensus is that consumers are still very confident about spending money, taking money out of overspending basically, or spending and not savings, or taking money out of savings, or buying on credit, and that has boosted the American economy. Well, curiously, businesses have been very cautious. Made a lot of cautionary notes about, well, we have to see what's going to happen on trade. I'm not sure this is the right time to expand. I'm not sure. But investors have had generally a good month, particularly a very good 2 weeks. Federal Reserve lowered the interest rate yet again. There are people buying, I think, a new watch. Dow Industrial hit a record, so S&P also is hitting records. Matter of fact, the S&P 500, the broad stock market index of common stocks, on pace for the best year since 2013. That should make my pension fund happy. Makes me happy. And if you look at the major stock indexes, look at the percentage year-to-date gains. Now your gain may be different, but Dow 17%, S&P 22%, NASDAQ that has a lot of technology stocks in it, 27%. And you go down the indexes. Then you look at some of the one of the European exchanges, or 20%, Japanese 14%, and of course the Hong Kong exchange. You can understand why Hong Kong would be having their stock exchange be having some problems at this point. But companies are cutting back. Consumers are partying on, and that's good news for America, and I think it's good news for the president. This is out of The Economist magazine. America's economy is resisting the pull of recession. One poll recently, that Daily Council poll, that asked people about their confidence in a variety of the president and his major contenders. How confident? Well, you would think a president who is governing during the times in which we just looked at some of the stats would do a lot better than 27%. I mean, this is, have a lot of confidence in the handling of the economy. But then you have to look at in a comparison basis. He's doing almost twice as well as everyone else. A major Democratic candidates, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders. So you have to look at that as not a bad couple of weeks for the president. Yet his communications, instead of focusing on ISIS or the economy, has a drift from time to time. Some say it's because of watching Fox and Friends and what's on Fox and Friends during the time he watches it, what's hot there. decided to go after Governor Newsom on our fire policies, particularly our forest fire policies, our forest clearing policies, taking despite the fact the recent fires were basically not forest-related fires. I think the President and all Americans are outraged by what happened recently in Mexico with the family that were gunned down. Talk about someone that's going to be in the White House, that one teenage boy that took the other children and hid them. If he doesn't get an award, no one deserves an award. I mean, what a great, courageous thing. The President called upon a war on drug cartels. I think all Americans would agree on that. It was immediately rejected by the President of Mexico. And why would that be the case? Well, you could say, well, maybe that's just the way Mexico operates. But you also have to look at the history of the U.S. involvement in Mexico. President Polk looked at ways to get involved in Mexico, and that led to the Mexican-American War, that we were able to help seize part of the Southwest that weren't in America at the times. So some have said that the President might have been a little bit more subtle and to try to help deal with these drug cartels that are basically running large portions of Mexico at this time. Let's move on. Oh yes, there's something else. Let's see, we got fire, we got massive killings, we got the economy, we got ISIS, and we have the impeachment inquiry. And next Wednesday, the public hearings are going to begin in the House Intelligence Committee. The Republicans are apparently going to shuffle their leader on those discussions to bring over Congressman Jordan to be part of that, appoint him to the committee so he can participate as one of their lead people in defending the president. Apparently, Ambassador Taylor is going to be the lead-off witness and talk about what he knows. And since his transcripts are out, it's easy to anticipate what his testimony will be. The President has strongly set his defense as there's no quid pro quo. Listen, read the transcript. I never said that I just said I want a favor. I didn't say that if you didn't give it to me, what you would get, or if you did give it to me, what you would get. As a matter of fact, if you look on, and I'm sure some of you do, look on the Trump campaign website, you can get your own, read the transcript t-shirt. I expect some of you will wear it into the next class. And you can get your Make America, Keep America Great shirt as well, or Women for Trump, as well as other merchandise. So that's a key message that the White House is putting out. Ambassador Sondland had a change in mind that he didn't remember discussing a quid pro quo when he first testified in the deposition. But when anyone who's ever done a deposition, and I've done at least one in my life, that you have an opportunity to read what you say and make corrections. And so he made a major correction that he now remembers that discussion. Now that Democrats say that's why you do depositions behind closed doors. Even if your Republican colleagues are with you, that you can find, the witnesses can't directly adjust the truth or their testimony about the truth based upon what they've heard or seen. But we'll see how these, when the public testimony occurs, and they'll be subject to debate from the president's supporters. This is the latest from yesterday. Do Americans support impeaching Trump? This is a compilation of polls and adjustments to polls to reflect what they call house effects. Polls that tend to be very Democratic are adjusted downward, as well as polls that look more Republican, or those to look, but there were 48% support impeaching the president. Now that's without any public hearings yet. 44% don't support. That is different than 2 weeks ago when we looked at it. You see don't support has gone up 1.5 and support has gone down about 1.7 from 2 weeks ago.
What's the margin of error?
It has no margin of error when it's a compilation of polls, because having several polls has a way of canceling out other margins. So yes, it's probably calculable, but it's not usually given as a margin of error, because if you take 10 polls, they have 10 different margins of errors. So it's like diversified stock. You have money here, you have money here, and you hope that they kind of balance out swings in the marketplace. While most Americans say Trump did something wrong, I think not all Americans are willing to say that's a removable offense. And not surprisingly, how you feel on this is pretty much based upon your party registration with independents. What has really happened, I think, is Democrats have warmed up to impeachment and removal, and Republicans have stayed pretty much the same. They don't like the idea of impeachment and removal for the reasons being stated. And if you break it down, this is from an LA Times poll that was published today, a national poll that's published today, gives you a little bit more gradation in that, because you have remove now, not sure, or it's too soon, versus acquit on all charges. Not surprisingly, 68% are Republicans in that poll with a margin of error, and I didn't copy that part, but I imagine it's 4 or 5% margin of error. Republicans are highest on acquit, and lean Republicans number 2. Independents are, kind of 40% removed from office, 42% not sure, 18% acquit. Now, 4 weeks ago, a big issue was, was this impeachment allowed under House rules or not? And while the House parliamentarian and the Democratic leadership said, yes, it is, well, the Democratic leadership decided to get the vote to structure the next phases of the process. Now, before we talked about how this was a 2-step process. Impeachment is bringing of charges. It's not trial on the charges. It's kind of a grand jury analysis. And then the Senate is the jury, with the Chief Justice being the judge of law, not of fact. And it takes a 2/3 vote of senators to remove the president. What I think has occurred in the House is we got another stage in there, and that's a stage called investigation. Or at least that's what the Democratic leadership is saying. That what has occurred and what is occurring through the time of it reaching the House Judiciary Committee is the investigation stage. Now, there was no special prosecutor or special counsel or independent counsel as under Clinton that presents a report that you already have the investigation. Now you can move it to the Judiciary Committee to see if there should be articles of articles of impeachment. But anyway, the vote came it became a very partisan vote. No Republican voted to allow the inquiry to proceed under the proposed rules. But 29 of 31 Democratic members of Congress from districts that Trump carried 3 years ago, 29 out of 31 voted for the rule to proceed, the process to proceed. Only 2 voted against the rule. And remember, I think I told you last time how Nancy Pelosi's view of bringing items up was that count your votes, and when you have them, have the vote. And I think she just realized she had the votes, so she took it to the floor and got the votes to proceed and structure the process. Basically, this is an outline of how the process is going forward. Just lost my mic. Here we're back again. How the process going forward. The Intelligence Committee will be in charge of public hearings, pre-Judiciary Committee public hearing. Think of it, the investigative stage public hearings. The chairman can add additional rounds of questioning for himself and the ranking member. The shift is authorized to publicly release the transcripts. Republicans may request to call witnesses and issue subpoenas. However, Democrats can block it. The Republicans said today they're going to call the whistleblower, subpoena the whistleblower. Democrats say, well, we have a whistleblower protection law, so that's going to be an interesting way, and probably that one will not be approved, but we'll see. Trump and his counsel are allowed to attend all Judiciary Committee. So once it reaches the Judiciary Committee, and can cross-examine witnesses during the considerations of articles of impeachment. But that's not in the investigative stage, that's in the next stage after this. Okay. Now, all sides on this issue are letting their views be well known. Supporters of the president have talked about how this is not something that the way you should approach impeachment, both in substance and in process. Today in the Washington Post, I think, maybe it was New York Times, Hugh Hewitt talked about how the Senate must not legitimize the House sham impeachment, in his view. He said there's 3 ways you can go, the Senate could go. One is a quick dismissal, probably by almost like tabling the issue as it comes over from the House, if it comes over from the House. One is long, a full and extensive trial, such as the one that was given to Andrew Johnson, 6 weeks. Or a third, more of the Clinton type of negotiated trial, in which you kind of get on with it, you do it, you know how the vote's going to basically turn out, and you then go on and do your legislative or political business thereafter. We'll see. 538 website had this, and I think it's a well done piece, and I posted this and some of the other articles you just saw on our class website. The Constitution doesn't give the president any protections during impeachment. You know, it sees the office as a president being a privilege. Let me go to this mic. Let me change mics here. That you hear, how's that?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, holding the office of the presidency is a privilege and not a right, and therefore you don't have the full due process, at least in the impeachment process. You do in the trial process. And the Nixon and Clinton trials were different, but the substance were different too. You know, it was a divided House. You know that many Republicans called for having that, having a vote, and then dismissed having the significance of the vote. Some said that the evidence is already tainted. That the fruit of the poison limb, or limb of what? Fruit of something. Fruit of the poison limb. Poison tree. Something's poison. Others point out that Nancy Pelosi kind of is still at the top of her game in terms of being able to rule a caucus that has major disagreements between moderate Democrats and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Okay, let's move on. Still, they were taking depositions. This Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is apparently going to be one of the key witnesses in the public phase. He has an interesting background. He is from Ukraine. He was profiled by Ken Burns when he was a child and talked about how he and his brother were great examples of persons who have come to the country and contributed so much to the country's betterment. Presidential aides now have to get attorneys because they've been subpoenaed. And John Bolton, said apparently today, or at least it's being reported today, that he will not show up for the deposition, but he will happily testify if the court allows him to testify, and he wants to testify primarily in public and not through deposition. So he could be the wild card in all of this. If I were Mike Pence, I would be thinking, this has nothing but upside for me. Peggy Noonan wrote in the Wall Street Journal, this is really getting real now. And the resolution setting forth the rules make it that way, but Democrats can still overplay their hands if they don't show due respect to the witnesses that might provide contrasting testimony. On one hand this, on the other hand this. That may not be like in real life, people that see gray areas. Now General Kelly, former President, Chief of Staff, former head of the Homeland Security, was at a speaking engagement the other day, and they asked him, to kind of comment on what's happening at the White House, and he had the comment about his successor. I said, whatever you do, don't hire a yes man. Someone who won't tell you the truth. Don't do that, according to the Washington Examiner, who covered the event. Because if you do, I believe you will be impeached. The American Enterprise Institute wrote the other day on its blog that the whole impeachment process has made Washington so partisan, even things that could have been done on a nonpartisan basis this year won't get done. They might not have gotten done anyway, but this ensures it. Democrats don't want to give the president any victory. The president doesn't want to give Democrats any credibility as we go into the 2020 election. We'll see. How about the man? Trump's lawyers continue to claim immunity from large aspects of the law. However, an additional Circuit Court of Appeal has ruled on on access to the president's taxes and said he needs to turn them over, particularly since they reside with his accounting firm. Some say this is an easy one for the Supreme Court to rule on because they'll say having those records go from the CPA is different than demanding it directly from the president. It will go up to the Supreme Court. It's hard to believe the president will win on this one. Might win on other ones, but we'll see. President realized he couldn't appoint either the two people he wanted to appoint as Director of Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security. So he appointed another guy, this guy, to be yet another acting secretary in his cabinet. Remember when the Cal State Fullerton had so many acting deans? We have a presidency with a lot of acting. And why is that? Well, in part, the secretary is on a shorter leash, because if they do well, remember we have an acting chief of staff, and that doesn't even require Senate confirmation. I can move someone else in. I can see that. And also some may not be confirmable. You propose them and there may be enough members of your own party that will raise objection. Who knows, but we have now an acting Secretary of Homeland Security. What's the polling? How about the president's popularity? 54.5 disapproval. Think of that. After the economic news, after the ISIS news, 54.5. Well, he must be doing disapprove, must be doing better than before. Before, disapprove 53%. So, is it the impeachment that's weighing him down, or are people not giving him the credit he thinks he deserves? I mean, any president thinks he deserves it. I mean, not say that for the economy or for the ISIS. It seems too good. I mean, this has been a good week, 2 weeks. Now, others would say, hey, presidents weren't that popular at this time during this time in office after 1,000 days. Look at Obama. In terms of where the president's job approval was with many of the past presidents. The one thing that's fairly consistent with this president, he's been unpopular during almost all 1,000 days. Some have gone up and then down, but he's been pretty much across the board. 1 in 3 Republicans say Trump doesn't make them feel proud. 4 in this is a Washington Post, no, this is an AP, Associated Press poll that the Washington Post reported on. Associated Press, that 1 in 3 Republicans say Trump doesn't make them feel proud. 4 in 10 Republicans say Trump doesn't make them feel excited, among Republicans only. I won't go into this. I have the audio. He did better when he went to Madison Square Gardens for the other fight. This was in The Economist magazine. Now, people point out that it's an occupational hazard for any president to go to a big mass event that you haven't filtered the people coming in. That you're going to have, in our democracy, you're going to have people booing you and people cheering you and people doing obscene gestures to you. The president found that by going to see the Washington Nationals. Okay, the immediate agenda. Because there's a lot more going on than the impeachment. There's a lot more going on that the presidency and the president and our government has to deal with, America has to deal with. We still have North Korea, testing weapons, testing their missile delivery systems. We have Iran upgrading their nuclear capability, restarting their facility that is underground and is designed to be hard to blow out. We have this young man continue to say that he's happy to negotiate with America, but we have to lose our Cold War intentions. So we have the nuclear issue still on the table. We also have the Mideast peace seems to be slipping away of the ability to bring across a deal. I think the president and Mr. Kushner had the theory that they could divorce the Palestine Liberation Organization and Fatah from the population by having some big incentives, economic incentives. That has yet to occur. We have the Iraq government having hundreds of deaths now, 5 just the other day, hundreds of deaths of their own citizens protesting the government. But here's what they're also protesting. They're protesting the Iranian influence in their government. They're protesting, they started to burn down the Iranian embassy in Iraq. Now, if you look at it on their traditional kind of tribal or religious differences, it's pretty much the Sunni versus the Shiites all over again, with the Kurds say, just leave us alone, just leave us alone. But Iraq is teetering. The president's love affair with Netanyahu has somewhat cooled. Netanyahu's love affair with the president has somewhat cooled. We have President Erdogan visiting the White House next week. And we'll see what happens with that. We have the UK having a snap election. Again, The Economist. They have very short election seasons. They have. I think it's probably a good. You think our country may need to have a shorter election period, but you have to change the Constitution and limit probably almost First Amendment rights. How long can you talk before an election? But United Kingdom's snap election with Boris Johnson yesterday was the first day of campaigning, and one of his cabinet secretaries resigned. But he's still in the polls ahead, but it's not clear that his party is going to get the number of seats necessary to govern. But the president decided to weigh in on the British election. And he called the talk show of the leading supporter of Brexit and criticized the Boris Johnson Brexit proposal that he negotiated with the European community. The Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said, Donald Trump is trying to interfere in Britain's election to get his friend Boris Johnson elected. It was Trump who said in June, the National Health Service is on the table. And he knows if Labour wins, U.S. corporations won't get their hands on it. Our NHS, National Health Service, is not for sale. So Trump may be part of the British election. We seem to be headed towards that phase 1 deal. It was going to be done this month. Apparently now it's not going to be done until next month. It was going to be done in America and signed. Now it's not going to be done in America and signed. Apparently the Chinese said, okay, we got basically a deal. We got basically a deal. Yeah, I don't have my microphone, right? We have basically a deal, and the Chinese said, but we want those other tariffs to be removed. So we'll see where we end up. Sooner or later, I think this U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement will occur, but just still hanging fire. There's only so many what they call legislative days left before the end of this year in the House and the Senate, and it will take some debate. Attorney General Barr apparently is going to release his Russia report that will be probably critical of the some officers in the FBI and the Justice Department apparently by the beginning of before Thanksgiving. So stay tuned. That may be a major part of our talk next time. And next week in the Supreme Court, the DACA matter will be heard. The lead case is the United States Department of Homeland Security versus the Regents of the University of California on a petition from a writ of certiorari. This dispute concerns, this is right from the briefs, concerns the policy immigration enforcement's discretion known as the deferred action for childhood arrivals. And it goes through it, and then it says, the questions presented are as follows. 1, whether the Department of Homeland Security decision to wind down the DACA policy is judicially reviewable. In other words, can the court even review it? Is that part of the separation of powers and the enforcement of the laws that is not subject to court review? And if it is done, whether it's if the court does have a review right, what the administration proposing by ending DACA is lawful or not. So we'll see. And we still have that circuit court in New Orleans about to issue for weeks now their decision on the Affordable Care Act. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the 2020 campaign, or do I repeat myself? 88 days till the Iowa caucuses, if my counter is right, and the start of the California primary voting. We're getting closer. Who's running for president? We have that list without him. O'Rourke is out. Speculation, who would likely be the next people out? Well, probably Castro, Delaney are probably the most likely ones, maybe next one, but we'll see. There's a number of reasons. I mean, the O'Rourke dropping out certainly didn't surprise people, but it shows that once you have these milestone events coming up, such as the show of strength at that Iowa Democratic event, in which you're in a sports stadium and you have seats that you can reserve for your supporters. You know, just the infrastructure of campaigning is so difficult. And you have to be here, and you have to be there, and you have to be building an organization in the first 4 or 5 states and hope that your campaign catches on. He's out. Swing voters who might decide the 2020 election was the subject of an extensive New York Times survey. And they concluded based upon their poll, or concluded based upon that poll, but not necessarily concluded for all times, is the truly persuadable voters is 1% of all adults in America have the votes to decide the 2020 presidential election. And they looked at certain critical states in the presidential election process. They looked at 6 states in which you probably, to become president, you have to win at least 3 of them. And they saw a very close race with the president ahead in several of the states. Now some say it's too early to do head-to-head polling because Democrats traditionally, just as Republicans traditionally will rally to their nominee, someone they think they won't vote for now or not sure they vote for, they may come home to. This is probably a great argument for both Biden and Sanders, if you look at the numbers on the chart. Biden had in Pennsylvania in a matchup, Sanders essentially even, but on the good side of being even. Warren even as well, but then you see in Michigan, Florida, and North Carolina may be very challenging states for Senator Warren. We'll see. Then the president ran an ad at during the World Series game. He has the money. And let's see if I can pull this up. I think it's a good political ad, and it is a good way of framing the issue.
President Trump is changing Washington, creating 6 million new jobs, 500,000 new manufacturing jobs, cutting illegal immigration in half, obliterating ISIS, their caliphate destroyed, their terrorist leader dead. But the Democrats would rather focus on impeachment and phony investigations, ignoring the real issues. But that's not stopping Donald Trump. He's no Mr. Nice Guy, but sometimes it takes a Donald Trump to change Washington.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Those Democrats who kind of get overly confident have to think about how you take a political campaign, all the issues, and you boil it down. You know, it used to be how you boil it down on a bumper sticker. These days, how do you boil it down to a 30-second ad that you either put on Facebook or you put on broadcast television or what have you. And you see what this was from one of the commentators in the Washington Post. Trump unveils his re-election strategy at the World Series. Democrats should be nervous. And you look at some of the benchmark or some of the battleground states, swing states, probably in this next election, and you look at the support for impeachment and removal and oppose, and you see that Democrats in those states at this point, or support for impeachment, is running behind in every one of those states. In every one of those states. Moody Analytics likes to do an economic forecast of how politics will end. Now, Moody's did a better job in rating bonds. We might not have had a housing crisis or housing implosion in 2007. And I say that half in jest. But they have an economic model. They plug in the numbers and tell you who will be president. And they predict that the president will win easily in 2020 if the economy holds up. If voters were to vote primarily on the basis of their pocketbooks, the president would steamroll the competition. 3 of their models show Trump getting at least 289 electoral votes and as many as 351, assuming average turnout. However, in 2016, it indicated that Clinton would get a narrow victory. Now, there's Democrats would say, or Democratic campaign managers say there's a couple of things wrong. One, the president may not be getting from the public because of a very highly partisan view of world economic events the credit he should be getting from the economy. 2, it is unlikely to be an average turnout on either side. And with Democrats tending to lag in turnout, that may push the Democratic numbers up. But I think it does show this is likely to be it's starting out to be likely a very close election. Who knows? Things can change very quickly. Such as unemployment in some of those swing states are not going down to where the national unemployment is. So that could be a problem. If you look at the change in employment or change in unemployment, and you look at red is bad, you can see some of those Midwest states or the Minnesotas and the Wisconsins are not and Pennsylvanias are not necessarily feeling all the advantages of the economic recovery as other states do. Texas is doing very well. California is doing relatively well. And if you do even a 3-month trend, you see that even in a greater dimension. You see Arizona lagging, one of the states that might be flippable this time. So we'll see. So how about what's happening on the Democratic side? Well, Senator Warren put out her plan on Medicare for all. We'll talk about that in a final thing later on. Biden tested in Iowa. He seems to be lagging. Doesn't seem to be, he's at fourth now in Iowa. Is Iowa going to be, will start kind of a domino effect for him in the bad way? Or can he just lose in Iowa, make a strategic decision? I'm not going to go and emphasize New Hampshire either, because that's between Vermont and Massachusetts. I'm going to South Carolina. I'm going to Nevada. I'm going to focus on the Super Tuesday vote in California and elsewhere. We'll see. Buttigieg is doing quite well in Iowa. Iowa seems to be a state that you couldn't almost profile a better state for him. He's ahead of Biden in Iowa. He's traveling the state. He has the money, and he's starting to break out there. And he and Warren were almost basically seemed like they were just talking to each other at the big Iowa event, which kind of suggests that maybe and the media gave them that attention too. And they started to attack each other. Nicely attack each other. But Buttigieg has a problem with black support. He just doesn't seem to be picking any up. But also Warren and Sanders have problems in the black community, because Biden seems to be doing quite well among at least older African Americans, higher, after you get beyond the age of 40, African Americans. What's happening to Kamala? I mean, she could be the next one out. She's closing down her campaign, all but closing down her campaign apparatus in New Hampshire, betting the farm, so to speak, in Iowa, and doesn't seem to be catching on there. California may not be a firewall for her. She'll probably get at least 15% in some of the congressional districts that will allow her to get a delegate in a proportional system, but may not. We may be too late as a firewall. Bernie Sanders has decided to say, hey, you can attack me on age, but age is a good thing. How many of you agree on that? I think age is a good thing. Since you can't do the other, what are you going to do about it? A survey of New Hampshire voters, younger voters, say Elizabeth Warren supporters love that she's so similar to Bernie Sanders, and older voters love that she's so different. So she's kind of has some support in both demographics. How much does Medicare for all cost? Well, there's no consensus. It could be 34 million, it could be 58 million, it could be less, it could be more. Trillion. Thank you, trillion. Not billions, but trillion. It can be 34 trillion, 58 trillion, based upon two different estimates. Now, Elizabeth Warren says she can fund a 20.5 trillion over 10 years Medicare for all. And she came up where she would get it from. 8.8 trillion over 10 years in new or expanded employer taxes. 3.7 trillion stronger tax enforcement and taxes on extra take-home pay. 3 trillion taxes on the top 1% and billionaires. $3.8 trillion taxes on large corporations and financial firms. $400 billion tax revenue from overhauling the immigration laws, and $800 billion cuts to military spending. Interesting. When you add all her programs that she's proposing over 10 years, she's proposing $30.5 trillion, $3 trillion for climate change, $2.9 trillion for education and child care, $3.1 trillion in additional Social Security benefits, particularly for lower income persons, $500 billion for housing, and pocket change of $410 billion for other activities. Liberal economists, and a good economist, I think, some will differ, Paul Krugman, said, hey, the financing appears to work for the number, the top line number, that for the 20 billion trillion estimate. However, he thinks that it is not the plan he would like to see. Others say she goes 1 for 2 on Medicare. At least she has come up with where she would get the money, and you can doubt the political feasibility of getting the money, but at least she's pointed that out. But how do you get her top line number? How much is this going to cost? It's troublesome to some. Others, even again moderates, have written the math for Warren's health care plan adds up if you accept its premise. Ludicrous premise. The Wall Street Journal, you wouldn't expect it to be very happy. Warren has a fantasy plan. Her financing and savings ideas bear no relation to reality. Sanders said, hey, my way I finance is a lot better than the way Warren finances. Through a 7.5% payroll tax. Some has doubted that that's way too low to get to the numbers being projected. The problem we have, and I hope this video runs, if not I'll narrate it. The problem is, what is Medicare for all?
Healthcare for all. What does that mean? Public opinion polls show strong support for efforts to expand health coverage to more Americans. But the list of proposals is long, and the phrases used to describe them are often sloppy sloganeering. Let us help you cut through the confusion. Universal coverage means everyone has health insurance. Universal coverage can be provided by the government or a private company or some combination. In a single-payer system, the government pays all medical bills and sets prices for medical procedures. Canada has a single-payer system. It is not the same as socialized medicine, where the government owns the hospitals and clinics and employs the staff. Great Britain's National Health Service is an almost fully socialized health system. A public option is a plan sponsored by the government that individuals may purchase. Private insurance plans would remain, and the public option plan would compete with them for customers. Medicare is the government program that insures 60 million people, most age 65 and older. It's very popular. Medicare, however, does not have very generous benefits compared with most private insurance plans. For example, you need separate insurance for prescription drugs, and there is no limit on out-of-pocket costs. Backers of Medicare for All proposals want to expand current Medicare to the entire population and enhance the benefits, too. Medicare for All plans would minimize the current role of private insurance plans, and some would eliminate them entirely. Some people would like to expand Medicare gradually. This is sometimes called Medicare for More. It might simply lower the eligibility age to 55 or 50. Or it could begin by adding children and gradually move the eligibility age up until everyone is covered. Another variation would keep the current Medicare coverage, but let people not now eligible purchase it. These Medicare buy-in proposals might allow people ages 50 to 64 to opt in, or Medicare might be available for purchase to those who don't get insurance at their job. All these plans will cost the government, that is, taxpayers, more. How much more? Well, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Equation at this point is a Medicare for all good politics? Another question is it good policy? And those two things might be separate. Hillary Clinton said, I think yesterday, that she thought Medicare for all was a good thing, but not achievable. And because of the transition process of getting there from here. We're going to spend a little bit of time at the Money News class more on healthcare systems across the world, but there seems to be three big reasons why healthcare costs more in America, costs more from our economy than in other countries, either double or at least 50% higher than that share of the economy that goes to healthcare, either privately or publicly. Why is America so high? Because you have these different models in different countries. You have the model of the UK, in which the doctors in the hospitals are either government employees or government owned or operated, or the Canadian one, in which you have private hospitals, and we have nonprofit hospitals here, and governmental hospitals, where you have a mixed system in which the doctors are not employees of the state, and a mixed system in which you can supplement or accelerate coverage through private insurance. And you have our system, in which we have a social safety net program in Medicaid, expanded through the Affordable Care Act, and you have Medicare for 65-year-old and older, and then you have this middle system that is a private insured system that is employer-based, where the employer provides. So what makes America cost more? Well, some of the data seems to be pretty clear, at least on 3 points, and there's probably more points than this, but I think that the three predominant points. One, and utilization rates are surprisingly similar in our system as in the public funded systems. Number of people that come in for certain types of tests, number of operations performed per 10,000, what have you. And some of the differences is how many of those have to do with the demographics of the nation and the general health of the nation. But one reason, and it's been mentioned almost in every political campaign, is the high cost of pharmaceuticals. High cost of pharmaceuticals. It's, particularly those that originate in America, have our American patent protection, and they can make their nut, if you would, make their profit in America, and then they could sell it at discount overseas and make even more. They don't have higher pharmaceutical costs. Now, with that, a lot more pharmaceutical invention, pharmaceutical testing in America. But if you look at just the cost side, it is one of the reasons. is the cost of drugs. These are the top 3 reasons, not in any particular order. Another reason is the high cost of administering health care in America. And that includes the insurance companies. But it also includes the hospitals. It includes the physician practices in which there are administrative staff. High costs, much higher than other countries. And just in our own country, the Medicare cost of administration, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, their percentage they add on top of their costs is relatively minuscule compared to the private insured companies. Plus, they don't have to market it. It's administrative and marketing costs that you want to differentiate through marketing or through different product differentiation to be able to sell more. And the third reason is the whole cost chain of providing in terms of salaries. Now, who begrudges a doctor getting paid well if you're being diagnosed for an illness that may have serious complications up to and including disability or death or one of your loved ones? Are you particularly concerned about how much money the doctor is being paid? Are you particularly concerned how much money in profit if a hospital is making? Are you concerned about the middlemen or the middle providers between the pharmaceutical companies and the actual recipients of the pharmaceuticals? But if you add that all up, those costs, the cost of operating a hospital in America, cost of operating a clinic, you add up, that's another big cost factors. We pay, I told you the story of this one person related about how they weren't able, or their child wasn't able to become a teacher. I think it was in Japan, and had to become a doctor instead. Why is that? Well, the cost structure is different. So those are 3 big things. So when they talk about what the top line is, it's unlikely that Americans are going to want to utilize health services any less. Matter of fact, if it becomes lower cost, or at least lower, if you remove the co-pays and the premiums and any barriers to accessibility, at least in the short term, you would think there would be even a higher demand. You're coming in to make sure you have it. You're going to use all your drugs now, just not every other day. And secondly is, are you going to pay hospitals less? Are you going to pay doctors more? How do you bring down the cost? You bring down the cost through the reimbursement and have a mixed model. If you have a mixed model, which they're talking about, I don't think Sanders or Warren are talking about a government owning the hospitals and the clinics and the pharmaceutical companies and employing the doctors directly. That you have to have a lower rate for the providers. And you have to take Americans that get their insurance and get their health care in so many different ways through this change to the promised land. Now, it may end up, once you get to the promised land of the Medicare for all, or whatever it is called at the time, a much better system that takes less of the economic resources of the nation, or provides better service because it uses the same amount of resources, but at least now it's going more to health care than into the catchy TV ad. I think many of you have seen the catchy TV ads for Medicare now, that now my HMO can offer these services. Well, basically what the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare did, was allowed Part C Medicare to provide them as an optional basis. So now these companies are putting them into their marketing as if there's a new benefit. You still pay for them. If you add to the benefits, you still pay for the benefits. You know, you still pay for them. It's just that now it's another eligible thing you can put in. You don't have to put in. But the marketing costs. So Democrats have said very clearly in polling that the number one issue for them is either health care or defeating Donald Trump. The issue, I think, that we'll see play out both in the Democratic nomination fights and in the general election is whether you can do both. And thank you for coming.